The relationship between the United States and Cuba is one of the most complex and consequential in the Western Hemisphere. For more than a century, it has shaped regional politics, influenced global power dynamics, and affected the lives of millions of people. To understand why Cuba still matters in 2026 and why recent events in Venezuela have sent shockwaves through Havana, we have to begin at the roots of this relationship. At the end of the 19th century, Cuba was a Spanish colony fighting for independence. When the United States intervened in the Spanish-American War in 1898, Spain was defeated and Cuba emerged from colonial rule. But independence came with limits. The United States retained significant political and economic influence over the island, formalized through agreements that allowed intervention in Cuban affairs and control over strategic infrastructure. American businesses soon dominated Cuban sugar, utilities, and tourism, and for decades Havana remained closely tied to Washington. This arrangement bred resentment. Many Cubans felt their sovereignty was compromised, and their economy served foreign interests. By the mid-20th century, corruption and inequality fueled revolutionary sentiment. In 1959, Fidel Castro and his movement overthrew the U.S.-backed government of Fulgencio Batista. The new government nationalized industries and seized U.S.-owned property. In response, the United States severed diplomatic ties and imposed economic sanctions. Isolated from Washington, Cuba turned to the Soviet Union for survival. During the Cold War, this alliance placed Cuba at the center of global tensions. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 hardened Cuban resolve, and the discovery of Soviet missiles on the island in 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Although disaster was avoided, the United States made clear that Cuba would remain an adversary. In the decades that followed, Washington enforced a comprehensive embargo against the island, the longest-running sanctions regime in modern history. The stated goal was political reform. The result was economic stagnation and chronic shortages. Cuba survived largely through Soviet aid until the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s plunged the island into a deep economic crisis known as the Special Period. During the Special Period, Cuba faced severe shortages of food, fuel, and basic goods. While the government maintained control and preserved core social programs like healthcare and education, economic hardship became a permanent feature of daily life. Over time, limited reforms failed to generate sustained growth. For a brief moment in the 2000s, relations with the United States thawed. Diplomatic ties were restored, embassies reopened, and travel restrictions eased. Many believed the Cold War chapter between the two countries might finally close. That opening proved temporary. Changes in U.S. leadership led to renewed sanctions and a hardened stance toward Havana. By the early 2020s, Cuba entered what many analysts described as a polycrisis. Economic decline, infrastructure failures, and rigid political control fueled social unrest and historic levels of migration. Tens of thousands of Cubans began leaving the island each year in search of opportunity elsewhere. This fragile situation set the stage for the events of January 3, 2026. On that day, the United States launched a military operation in Venezuela, known as Operation Absolute Resolve. U.S. forces struck key targets in Caracas and captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, who was removed from the country and transported to the United States to face federal charges related to narco-trafficking and terrorism. The operation resulted in explosions across the capital and the rapid collapse of Maduro's government. Delcy Rodriguez was sworn in as acting president in the immediate aftermath. The consequences rippled across the region, but nowhere were they felt more sharply than in Havana. The Cuban government announced that 32 Cuban military and intelligence personnel were killed during the operation while operating in Venezuela in support of the Maduro regime. Havana declared national mourning and condemned the action as an act of aggression. The deaths exposed how deeply embedded Cuba had become in Venezuela's security apparatus, and how much it depended on the survival of the Maduro government. For decades, Venezuela had been one of Cuba's most important allies, supplying subsidized oil that powered much of the island's economy. When that support collapsed, the impact on Cuba was immediate and severe. In January 2026, President Donald Trump publicly warned that Cuba would no longer receive Venezuelan oil or financial assistance, and urged Cuban leaders to negotiate with the United States before it was too late. This loss of energy support compounded existing shortages and accelerated economic breakdown. Fuel shortages disrupted transportation, food distribution, and electricity generation. Public frustration intensified as daily life became even more difficult. Analysts warned that without Venezuelan oil, Cuba's economy could deteriorate faster than at any point since the 1990s. The Venezuela operation also carried symbolic weight. It demonstrated that long-standing allies of the Cuban regime were vulnerable, and that U.S. power in the region was being asserted in new ways. Some observers argued that the fall of Maduro marked the beginning of the end for Cuba's ruling system, removing its last major external lifeline. Others cautioned that authoritarian regimes often survive extreme pressure by tightening internal control. Inside Cuba, the government framed the events as proof of U.S. hostility and attempted to rally nationalist support. Internationally, the operation reignited debate about sovereignty, intervention, and the limits of American power. In 2026, Cuba stands at a crossroads. Decades of sanctions, internal economic failures, mass migration, and the sudden loss of Venezuelan support have weakened the state. Whether this moment leads to regime collapse, structural reform, or continued authoritarian resilience remains uncertain. What is clear is that the events of January 3, 2026 have fundamentally altered the balance of power in the region and pushed U.S.-Cuba relations into their most consequential phase in decades. If you found this breakdown informative, leave a like, comment your thoughts below, and subscribe for more context on events shaping the world.